Welcome to the Strength Athlete Podcast, episode number 30. Very excited. Today we're going to be joined by Paul Ingraham, who is a very interesting guy who puts together a very interesting website. But before we get into that, I do want to take a minute just to give a shout out to the sponsor of the Strength Athlete Podcast, that is SBD USA. They do make it possible for us to keep our episodes on the air, quite literally. So please do check them out, show them some support. The website is going to be SBD followed by a hyphen, followed by USA.com. Also, secondarily, if you're enjoying our podcast, please be sure to leave us a 5-star review in the iTunes store. That does help people to see our podcast and kind of motivates us to make them more often than once or twice a year, which, you know, I made this same joke in our last podcast, and lo and behold, here we are 8 months later. But we're going to do better this time. Anyway, back on track. So Paul Ingraham, welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And we're glad to have you, and we are joined as well by Bryce Lewis and Eric Bodhorn.
Hello.
Hello. Hey, guys.
Paul, I've been wanting to get you on for a while. Thank you so much for coming on. What got you into pain science? Tell me a little bit about your backstory. How'd you arrive where you are today, sitting in that chair?
I started out as a registered massage therapist in British Columbia, Canada, where there's a fair amount of training. There's a little bit more medical credibility in this area. So I took myself too seriously as a pain troubleshooter. And early on in my career as a massage therapist, I started styling myself as a specialist in difficult cases, which is laughable to me now. It's my pride and arrogance and ignorance was incredible in retrospect. But that's how I got interested. I was really keen, as well as clueless. And I started writing self-help articles because there was just too much material to cover in sessions. And the self-help articles took over, turned into a website that was then called saveyourself.ca, eventually evolved into painscience.com, which is now a very, very busy place that attracts extremely large numbers of readers, all to the same stuff, basically, that I was writing for my own clients in 2001.
So, I have a feeling we're going to anger some people in this podcast, which is exciting. But I can't tell you, you kind of touched on a nerve there. I can't tell you how many times that I have clients who are having pain-related issues, or I've talked to athletes who have pain-related issues, and like, don't worry, I'll talk to my massage therapist about it. And I'm like, does your massage therapist, are they trained in the depths of injury? Do they really understand movement of any kind? Have they ever trained with a barbell themselves? And it's funny that you say that, and you talk about how you kind of ended up with your own arrogance at the time, leading you to believe that you were capable of maybe what only a licensed professional would be. And obviously there are some very intelligent people out there, so I don't mean to take away from those of them that are capable, but it's almost like there's a false correlation between having any title and being able to solve any problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend today that someone go to a massage therapist to troubleshoot their difficult injury problem. Not as a general rule. I might recommend it for specific reasons, but yeah, I certainly don't see massage therapists as a category, as a profession, as being good troubleshooters for rehab or chronic pain. It is possible, of course, an individual massage therapist can excel, but the category, the group, is not well trained enough. Massage therapists around the world, on average, don't know enough. I had really good training for a massage therapist, much better than most massage therapists in the world get, but I did not have enough knowledge to be selling myself as a pain troubleshooter.
Actually, I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, because I get the impression from the website that it's well researched, it's academic, and it comes to things from almost like the discussion section of papers is kind of the readability that I get a lot of times as I'm looking through some of that stuff. How did you get from the massage therapy school to deeper into the science side of things, or how did that leap happen?
Entirely on my own initiative, slowly, painfully, and with a lot of luck, and knowing the right people, knowing people who could I was blessed to have friends and colleagues who were unusually ideal to help mentor and guide me through those early stages of becoming more scholarly, more academic in my approach. But in that regard, I was also clueless in the beginning. I started out as a science journalist, calling myself a science journalist well before I was really ready or had earned that. But hopefully I crossed that line long ago, after 5 rocky years where it was kind of, fake it till you make it. I like to think that I did make it.
So if I think we kind of skipped over just talking about your website in general. You mentioned it, but it's, and I think that's kind of a big relevant piece of this conversation. So Paul, your website is painscience.com. So
yes.
Can you give us a description of what your intention for the function of that website is?
It's to provide science-based advice to both patients and professionals on the tricky topic of pain and injury rehab. A world that is full of myths and misunderstandings and shallow understandings. So there's plenty of need for guidance. My goal is to be thorough, to write the most detailed articles on any given topic. I have a pretty simple rule. If there's something out there that's more detailed than what I've written, then I keep going until my article is more detailed. But of course, it's not just about quantity, it's about quality. And I try to make it simultaneously both more fun, more chatty, more easy to understand, while also still being scientifically rigorous. It's not a scientific journal, it's not peer reviewed. This is a one-man shop, but within those constraints, I do my absolute best to be as rigorous as possible in my citations. And the further out I go on a limb with any point, the higher the bar goes for how well it has to be supported by an actually relevant, good quality citation. So I work very, very hard at that balance, and that balance seems to be unusual on the internet. There's not a lot of other websites that have that. So that's my goal.
On that point, kind of a few unique things about your website that I've seen. One is that articles are regularly updated, and there's very few people I know who do that. They put out a content piece and that's it. It just lives and it exists and it ages with time as more information comes out, and eventually you may say, well, we're just not going to look at that one anymore, and here's the new one that has updated information. And the second thing is, you can hover over some of the citations and you actually grade the quality of the citations by how good the research was, or how robust the techniques were. Did they do double blind, or was it just a case study or something like that?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite features. Yeah, it's important for people to be able to check references. Nothing annoys me more, and I don't know what this insight came from 15, 18 years ago, but I was annoyed by citations you couldn't click on from the beginning. I thought, it's the internet. Why on earth would you publish a citation that you can't click on and see and go straight to the original source so that you can assess it yourself? Is the entire point of linking. It's the whole idea of the World Wide Web. So from day one, I wanted citations to be easily audited so that readers who were keen on it could actually check and see, oh yeah, is this guy saying something that's actually consistent with the citation, or does the citation say something else altogether, which happens amazingly often. Not on my website, but it's out there. The bogus citation that actually doesn't have anything to do with the point, surprisingly common.
It's an extremely effective methodology. Just make a claim, put a citation.
Yeah.
90% of readers probably won't even look at it. On the note of citations and research and grading research, your website's been around for 20 years now. 1999, which, you know, it doesn't surprise me that you use the term World Wide Web, having started your website in 1999. But I'm gonna leave that one alone. I'm not gonna give you a hard time about it. But,
I am old. I'm very old.
You've been writing about pain longer than probably a decent chunk of the listeners to this podcast have been alive. So, you know, you've been doing it for a long time, and you've seen a lot of research. And over that time period, have you noticed that there have been changes in the ways that research are done? You know, maybe the things have become more rigorous and more, let's say, what's the term that I want here? Valid, maybe? Has there been some sort of shift in the kind of the paradigm of how research is done over that time period?
Yes, there has. And there's good news and there's bad news. Let's start with the good. The period that I've been writing about pain is more or less the same as the ascendancy of the idea of evidence-based medicine, which is a surprisingly modern concept. If you go back 30 years and had a conversation with a doctor about evidence-based medicine, they wouldn't know what you were saying. They'd recognize the words and they might be able to quickly concoct a theory about what you meant, but it wasn't a thing. EBM was just getting rolling, really, when I joined, and in the last 20 years it's become a really big deal, and it has changed a lot about how research is done, and more importantly how clinicians and trainers work. So that's probably the biggest change, and it's EBM has a ton of problems, both optics problems and actual problems, but make no mistake, it's been a huge net gain over the last 30 years. So that's probably the biggest difference. The bad news, at the top of the bad news list, is definitely the proliferation of low quality journals and papers. And this is particularly a problem in our field, in exercise science, sports science, musculoskeletal medicine, rehab. All of those areas of research are particularly plagued by very large numbers of crappy little trials that don't actually establish anything. They just muddy the waters and give more opportunities for people to cite something that looks like it supports their point, but really has no power to do so. And that trend of extremely large numbers of low quality trials has been like insanely exacerbated by the predatory journal crisis, which is only 10 years old. And that is the problem of journals that are 100% fraudulent and exist solely for the purpose of hooking scientists into paying to publish, because their publish or perish pressure is so high. Scientists, junior scientists especially, are so desperate to publish that they will fall for this, and it is just a scam. And we now have, I don't know how high the numbers are now, but it's certainly over 10,000 well-established, completely fraudulent journals that contain nothing but not actually peer-reviewed quote-unquote science, and those clutter the results in PubMed. You can easily go looking for a citation on something, find a paper that's in a predatory journal, not have any idea that it's a paper in a predatory journal if you don't know exactly how to check, cite that sucker, think, oh, I am so evidence-based, check me out, and you don't realize that you've now effectively been scammed too. So that trend is just, it's still exploding. We're in the middle of that disaster, and it is making it very hard to cite effectively. You got a lot more junk to wade through now than you did 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. So that's the biggest negative change.
What would be the best way for somebody to differentiate those citations, whether it's from a fraudulent source or not?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest way is that there are lists of predatory journals. So you know where the lists are and you look them up, but it's not, the lists aren't comprehensive. It's a moving target. There's always new ones. So ultimately you're going to have to fall back on evaluating evaluating a paper on its merits, and that's a skilled process. I used to be more enthusiastic about helping beginners tackle this stuff, because I did. I mean, I was there. I was one once. But the longer I do the job, the more I think, yeah, it is just a bag of hurt to try to evaluate research quality without a substantial skill set. Like, you're just begging to make major mistakes. It's very, very hard for someone to do. You need a trusted guide, which is pretty much why I'm doing what I'm doing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
At a deeper level too, I think in researching pain science and treatment options, there's a problem with how to set up a good study that actually shows an outcome you're looking for, because for a lot of treatment options, coming up with a double-blind trial is not the easiest thing to do. Am I on the right track there?
Yeah, it's one of the challenges for sure.
For instance, if you wanted to test like ice therapy, like what's the placebo ice that the non-testing group is getting, or something like that?
Yeah, it's hard to disguise the fact that you're being iced. Yeah, and you fall back on second and third best options in those cases. Not every trial can be perfect in every way. Sure. That said, the methodological limitations that hold back most studies are not fundamental limitations. It would certainly be possible in principle to do a better job of the same trial in most cases. The problems are usually completely solvable, and it's almost always about it being just too small and not very well done, and major, unforced errors, let's call them. Statistical errors. A lot of junior researchers, they will pump out a paper and there's no oversight from a real statistician. Mm-hmm. They just don't have access to that service, and so they wing it. They Google stuff about the stats, and they wing it, and they get it wrong, and they make major mistakes. And a real statistician takes one look at the paper and goes, not fit to line a bird cage, and that's that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's tough.
So Paul, would you say that there is any particular field, like subset within pain science, where you see the most misinformation?
Yeah, sure. That's actually right over the plate. Acupuncture research is the king of bogus citations. There is almost literally an industry devoted to publishing positive studies of acupuncture, and the result is a particularly high percentage of references that are, they're superficially, they look sciencey, but the damning details are there every single time. So there's actually there's a great paper. I remember what it showed. Basically, China's scientific publishing industry has yet to publish a negative study of acupuncture. They only publish positive studies, mm-hmm. which makes you wonder what's happening to the negative results, because that's actually impossible even with therapies that work. If you do 100 studies of a therapy that is definitely effective, you will still get some of them coming out negative just by chance, if they're done properly, all other things being equal. So the fact that China cannot seem to produce a negative study of acupuncture is a very damning clue.
Mm-hmm. Well, they do call it ancient Chinese medicine. So, maybe they've just been doing it right for so much longer that they know how to hit the meridians right every time. Mm-hmm. And they're just better than we are.
That's possible. It is possible.
In a world where all things are possible, right? Random being truly random. There's a distinct, albeit infinitely small, possibility that that's the case. It's funny that you mention acupuncture, because I find that I don't understand the difference between acupuncture and dry needling. They're fairly similar in terms of how they're done, right? But the way that the places that they're executed are different, or something to that effect.
Yeah, they're quite different actually. They look extremely similar. So to the untrained eye, if you were viewing a dry needling session and an acupuncture session, you pretty much would not be able to tell the difference. But they have very different origin stories and completely different rationale. They are actually completely different under the hood. Do you want me to get into it? You want to break down?
Yeah, actually, I think this is something that probably more than a few listeners have dealt with. I've definitely been to an acupuncture session, but not a dry needling session, and I got nothing from that acupuncture session, I might add. But paid good money for it, gave away some money. But I would actually be really interested to hear about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So dry needling is something that's taken off, particularly in the physical therapy community. Lots of physical therapists around the world do this. It's also done by doctors, and basically it is replacing your thumbs with needles to massage the sore spots that almost everybody gets, which are colloquially known as muscle knots and somewhat more professionally known as trigger points. So these sore spots are everywhere. They are a well-known phenomenon. Nobody questions that they exist, but there is a lot of discussion, debate, controversy about what they are and how they work and what to do about them. So dry needling is basically based on the idea that maybe stabbing it will help.
I'm trying to imagine when somebody thought about that. They're like, man, how do we fix this? We should poke a needle into it.
Just try it, man. Just stick a needle in it, see what happens.
I mean, that's scientific research at its purest form, right? Like you're like, we could try poking it. We could try to kill it.
Yeah. And this kind of rationale, to my great amusement, is actually, that's the kind of thinking that has driven a lot of treatment ideas over the decades. It's actually not that unusual for treatment ideas to basically be that simple. And of course, no one sells them that way. It's always turded up with a bunch of sciencey sounding stuff. And I have read every serious attempt to explain why dry needling helps a sore spot that there is. I've read them all carefully. There's nothing there. There's no serious, believable understanding of why sticking a needle into one of these sore spots is going to make a difference. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be a response of some kind to being needled. Any interesting and intense sensation is going to drive some top-down modulation of pain via various mechanisms. If the recipient of the treatment believes that it's going to be helpful, you're already off to the races with a robust placebo effect. But it goes beyond that by generating a lot of weird sensations, and you will definitely get that from sticking needles in sore spots. You're gonna notice, you're gonna feel things, and that information, especially if the context is positive, if you believe that that's a good pain, that's a helpful pain, then that's really going to power potentially a significant short-term analgesic effect, just because the brain is good at modulating pain. And so you get a lot of love-hate relationship with needling. It's an intense experience, and some people walk away feeling wounded. And instead of the positive context, it's so intense that basically it spooks them. It feels dangerous instead of therapeutic, and the pain suddenly becomes a threat, and they have a bad experience. It's like a bad trip. And the opposite happens. People have profound experiences of, wow, that's such an intense sensation that I am having, and that was followed by 3 days of relief from my chronic pain. Mm-hmm. And so needling has a lot of passionate testimonials for it, but also an awful lot of people who feel quite literally injured by it. Their experience was they got worse, and in some cases they even stayed worse. And of course, those people tend not to go back to their dry needling therapists to say, hey, I didn't actually do very well with that. It's quite uncommon. So that's a bunch. There's still more. It's probably mostly the trigger point stuff and what is the point of needling a trigger point. But boy, is that a rabbit's hole. That is the topic of my largest book. My book about trigger points is the biggest publication I have I think it's 160,000 words. So there's plenty to say about trigger points.
Is that also one of the more popular articles on your website too, or what's the most popular content that people generally go to?
That's a big one, but there's all kinds of quirky, fun ones. Like I've always, since the early days, one of my most popular topics has been Epsom salts bathing, which I've just done a bizarre amount of work on, and it's a strange little topic, and it's an extremely popular article and still attracts thousands of readers every single week. I have a couple of articles now that dominate the top of my analytics. They are both when to worry about blank articles. And that really seems to interest people. One of them is when to worry about back pain. Another one is when to worry about neck pain. And the job of both of those articles is to mostly reassure people and mostly tell them you mostly don't need to worry about those things. Only in these rare special circumstances, and go through the red flags in a nice readable way. So those are some of the hot hits.
So kind of following up on that, what would you say is the topic that you have struggled the most to write about? So, in terms of, obviously content creation is a challenge in its own, but you clearly have done this very consistently for a very long time. And is there something that kind of sticks out to you as having been a big challenge to write about and to get some solid information on?
Yeah, for sure. There are definitely standouts in that category. Most of the topics that I write about are musculoskeletal medicine is way weirder than anyone suspects. It seems like the simple kind of biomechanical thing. I think in people's heads, brains are computers and bodies are machines and plumbing. It's so much more complicated than that. It's so interesting. So you get conditions like frozen shoulder that are clearly the tip of a pathological iceberg. There's nothing mechanical about it. It's all about wet, messy biochemistry and metabolism and autoimmunity and it's just a maze of way more complex and messy stuff than you would think from the outside of the field. So that's just generated an enormous amount of all kinds of topics that are harder to write about than you'd expect. More interesting too, but also hard. So probably the hardest of those has been fibromyalgia. That's what a mess that topic is. Whew. It's just brutal, and because it overlaps with so much medical stuff. In the beginning, I tried to stick to the mechanical, the stuff that a massage therapist would be interested in, the musculoskeletal system. Anything that seemed more medical or biological or pathological, I would tend to stay away from. But when I finally tackled fibromyalgia, I had to wade into that. You cannot get away from the biological and the pathological. So that was tough because I'm not a biologist and I'm not a doctor. So any time that I venture beyond the supposedly simple confines of musculoskeletal medicine and go out into the broader world of physiology and pathology, I have to be very, very careful. I have to move slowly. And of course, I've now learned from my early years how easy it is to screw up. So I tiptoe through that subject matter 1 inch at a time, trying never to make a move I can't back up. And that makes it I have to work 3 times harder than a doctor or a physiologist or a pathologist would have to work on the same stuff.
But you're a massage therapist.
Yeah.
You're right up there.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just almost the same thing.
In my mind, it's like oncologist, anesthesiologist, massage therapist.
People love to love massage therapy, but yeah, not many people mistake them for doctors. So.
You would be shocked. Well, maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you wouldn't.
Oh,
You
no,
probably
yeah.
wouldn't.
They get a lot of credit that they probably don't deserve.
Let me pivot off that last question.
Yeah.
What would you say is the subject that you have taken the most like joy and passion in writing about? If any,
Well,
it might all be work, but
Well, because I'm also in theory a creative writer and I have a personal blog, because of those things, everything that I do on painscience.com is, that's work. And I love my job, but it's my job. And so when I think of writing that I'm passionate about, my mind kind of immediately goes to the other stuff. But maybe a good example would be a couple of my most confessional pieces that I've written for the personal blog rather than Pain Science about my experiences with addiction and drug withdrawal and my own chronic pain problems, which are relatively recent. Those pieces, particularly my article about benzodiazepines, I accidentally got addicted to benzos during a medical crisis. It was not recreational use. And then I got off of them way too quickly and had a major horrifying withdrawal experience. And that article was, obviously wrenching to write. Going through the experience and then writing about it is, is hard stuff. But oh my God, the responses I get to that, the way that content has affected people and the mail that I get, it's amazing and rewarding and fascinating and horrifying. So that's like, there's a lot of passion there. Maybe not quite what you meant by the question, but that has been a very meaningful piece of writing to me.
Did you find the writing of that itself was kind of a cathartic releasing process for you after having gone through this?
Literally all of my writing is, even the work that I do. I am such an automatic and natural writer, and from a very, very young age, like we're talking 4 and 5 years old, I was already pretty clearly interested in writing down everything I experienced. Mm-hmm. And so I think I write to think. Okay. It's just how I process everything in life. It's not real until I've written about it. Mm-hmm. so it was definitely cathartic, but at the same time I had no choice. It's just what I do.
Yeah.
So do you find, or did you intend that when people are using your website to self-diagnose, which I'm sure there's got to be myriad people that do that. Yep. And with how comprehensive your website is that something that you anticipate and you are, let's say, maybe the words okay with are the wrong words for this, but that you don't necessarily actively discourage, or is that something that do you want it to be a tool for people to approach their doctors with? In that kind of that vein of self-diagnosis, what are your thoughts in terms of people doing that?
Yeah, well, Dr. Google is a problem, as we all know. And true hypochondriacs with real, a genuine psychological health issue are all out there using the internet to hurt themselves. So that's a real phenomenon. And it's the Spider-Man maxim: with great power comes great responsibility. And other than choosing not to publish, the only thing I can do is go to the opposite extreme and publish as well as possible, to not be kind of source of information that makes Dr. Google such a disaster for so many people. I think we probably could all agree that mostly the reason Googling your medical problems is a bad idea is because there's so many really terrible sources of information. And if you could magically make all of those go away, if you could somehow judge the quality of all of the healthcare information on the internet and just lop off the bottom half, just get rid of it, which would probably account for 98% of the content by weight, then Dr. Google would be fine. Wouldn't be that big a deal. Yeah, that problem just wouldn't really be much of a problem. So I work my butt off to get it right. I don't go out of my way to tell people how they should use the information. I have the standard disclaimers, but I don't make much of an effort specifically, to tell people, don't take this too seriously. I'm just a guy with a website. Instead, what I do as a specific alternative to that is just the very, very best critical analysis that I can possibly manage. Better that I raise the right questions in the reader's mind. As long as you're here, my attitude is you should be aware that this might be a concern and that might be a concern. So whereas another website might say, yeah, by all means, go to a massage therapist and see if you can get those knots worked out, my approach is much more, go to a massage therapist, but be extremely assertive about the pressure that you need. If you're afraid of being re-injured or hurt, then demand gentle treatment. So I raise the possibility that, you know what, not every massage is necessarily benign. Things can go wrong. So I tell people about that, caution them about it, get it into their heads that they might need to pay attention to this thing or that thing that they're not going to hear about on the next website. That's my approach. I have no idea if it's good enough.
Kind of like creating informed consumers.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's an extremely valuable outlook on how to provide information to people, right? Because the internet being what it is, right? You mentioned all of the bad information out there, and the website that jumps out in my mind is Yahoo Answers.
Yeah.
That is the worst. Karen from Middle America has told so many people that they have cancer. And you that's always like the first, second, or third result. It's usually like WebMD and then something else and then Yahoo Answers. So creating a tool that like empowers people to ask the right questions and to make the right choices and doesn't necessarily say, oh, you have this, this, and this, then you must have this problem. It kind of equips you with the tools to be able to have a more informed conversation on that when you go see a professional. I think that's a really intelligent and much more thoughtful approach to doing things, which is not surprising based on everything we've talked about so far. But that just makes a lot of sense, and it seems like a good place to start. Like I've got this owie, and it's not hyper urgent. I don't need to go see a doctor right this minute. Maybe I can look a little further and start to ask some questions and kind of narrow things down.
Yeah. And a good example of this would be that, I bring up the topic of trigger points for specific reasons in literally hundreds of places on my website. And every single time I make sure that the reader is aware that there is controversy about this. It is basically not possible to read anything about trigger points on my website without being exposed to that idea. And that idea isn't anywhere else. There's hardly any other information about that. You take, say, 5 popular books on this topic, not one of them has a discouraging word or any acknowledgement of controversy whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's probably, in this case, it doesn't even matter what the controversy is. I don't have to explain it. Just have to make sure that people are aware that, hey, there might be another perspective on this. And I got that straight from Harriet Hall. Dr. Harriet Hall, the Skep Doc at Science-Based Medicine. There's a bunch of people there I know very well. And Harriet says you always have to ask who disagrees and why of any idea. And that is a principle that guides me. I want to make sure that people ask that question.
I think a lot of times with pain science, it can be easy to fearmonger people, or say, watch out for this, or, is this thing holding you back, or something like that. How do you, what's the tone you take when you write? It seems to be more of a factual way instead of an at risk, or this might be affecting you.
Yeah, I'm really conscious of nocebo, and that is causing pain or harm through belief, the opposite of placebo. You guys are probably already familiar with nocebo, but lots of people aren't. And it's a pernicious phenomenon. It is amazingly easy to trigger. It is a real factor, and it is especially a real thing with people who are in chronic pain. Right? You just take the population at large. How big a problem is nocebo? This big. Take the chronic pain population. I mean, it is a huge factor. You do not want to discourage, frighten, or otherwise impair people who are already struggling. And so and this is a real juggling act for me, because there's so much of what I do is at least has the appearance of being negative in the form of debunking. So how do I, where does the positive come from? How do I avoid triggering nocebos? Well, the number one thing is humor. Make it fun as possible. It's tough subject matter to make true comedy out of, but I try to have a light tone to start. And then the next most important thing in avoiding nocebo is don't tell people that there's something wrong with them. You always couch always speak of things in terms of a phenomenon, not its impact, not how broken people are, and particularly avoid hypothetical sources of brokenness. So a really good example of this would be posture. There's a lot of fear mongering about posture, but we don't actually know.
My headache suddenly went away as I said, how strange.
Yeah,
like a light bulb.
Little postural adjustment, bam, no more headache. There are so many places that you can read about how your posture is killing you, and that's a hypothesis. We don't know that posture really hurts people. It's a fascinating topic, and we can dive into the details, but bottom line, we don't know. We just don't know. So don't say it. Don't say that you're being hurt, that people are being hurt by something, unless we absolutely know it. So that's kind of like right up there. After being a little whimsical, priority number 2 is just don't accuse people of having it could be this. You could be screwed up in this way. Yeah. Got to be very careful with that.
So on your website, Paul, there's a lot of reviews about various therapeutic treatments for pain.
Yeah.
And specifically the question that stems off from this is that, have there been many studies comparing the therapies themselves directly to each other to find out which ones work more effectively?
Well, in general, when you're testing treatments, you want to compare to a placebo, but of course, it's also a thing to compare treatments to each other, and that is generally a bad idea. That is taking a methodological risk, basically because when you're trying to establish efficacy, you want to eliminate as many variables as possible, and the placebo that's the whole point of the placebo, is to eliminate a lot of variables. There's no treatment going on here. Nothing's happening. This is an inert intervention, so that sweeps away a lot of variables. When you compare 2 treatments to each other to see which one is better, well, then both sides of the equation have a shitload of variables. And you can eliminate a whole bunch of those variables from one side by comparing to a placebo instead. So yeah, there's been a ton of that. but it's generally not a great idea. And it's an example of how you have a lot of interventions, or a lot of trials rather, that are not really helping that much, not really clarifying much. If you establish through comparative trials that therapy A is definitely better than B, C, and D, you are still going to have to go back to the drawing board and establish that any of them are better enough than a placebo, better than a placebo enough for any of them to be worthwhile. And in many cases, you have studies that show that treatment, say ultrasound, works a little bit better than physical therapy. And everyone says, oh, well, it must be awesome then, because physical therapy is great, right? I mean, there wouldn't be an entire profession devoted to helping people if it didn't work, right? So if the physical therapy works and the ultrasound works a little bit better, then ultrasound must be awesome. But what everybody's missing there is physical therapy is very poorly defined and incredibly hard to test as a whole. So usual physical therapy might be a comparison group. And you can't actually really count on that being a good standard to compare ultrasound to. And really what that study says is probably neither of them are very good. Mm-hmm. As opposed to the take home, rather than ultrasound awesome, should be neither very good. And that hardly ever gets discussed.
Let me get to where, for me, this question was coming from is kind of two specific cases. I was reading a book and they were talking about recovery methods, and they were saying cold water therapy works for recovery, hot water immersion works for recovery, and contrast therapy works for recovery. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, okay, well, I know these three of these things work. What am I going to do as an athlete? What am I going to suggest to my athletes? And there was another study on cryotherapy, and I think their control group was 10 minutes of walking. And both groups had kind of equal rates of recovery. And so there's a few ways to interpret that. And one way is, well, I can just walk for 10 minutes instead of doing cryotherapy. Or the other way is, well, maybe neither of them work very well at all. But, what are your thoughts on that?
I think you were off to a good start there. I mean, walking's light exercise is pretty good stuff in general. So that's my first reaction is, that's a reasonably good thing to compare to, because if something can beat it, it's probably noteworthy. But walking is a lot more convenient than cryotherapy. So if there's no significant difference between the two, then I would certainly pick walking. A lot less fuss, and probably other benefits too, whereas cryotherapy probably doesn't have many benefits beyond its effect on rehab, if it even has that.
Really, it's more coming from the stance of wanting to suggest the right thing for athletes instead of saying, here's 10 options, choose what you feel works best for you.
Yeah. You're going to run into the fact that we don't know what facilitates recovery. Mm-hmm. And this is, everybody wants to know and wants to prescribe something, but we all have to come to grips with the fact that despite the fact that it is 2019 and medicine has been at least, superficially evidence-based for a century, we still don't know a lot of things, including what helps recovery. And as I'm sure you know better than I do, lots of people believe that things help their recovery. And there's an immense world of belief out there about what helps you get better after a workout. Unfortunately, almost none of it is supported by the literature, and we just flat out don't have a very good idea of what actually does that job.
So, in making these choices, let me give like a scenario here. You've got a person who's in some kind of physical pain, and they have these options of modalities they could go to. They know a physical therapist, they know a chiropractor, they know a massage therapist, they know an acupuncturist, they have a cryotherapy place down the street.
Yeah.
Would you say that they could use your website as a manner of determining which one to go to and which will be superior, or is it kind of that they need to try and see what they like most, or how do we find the right tool for the right job?
Yeah, what I advise people to do is to find the best troubleshooter. That the specific professional category doesn't matter, but that as a consumer you have to seek out the healthcare professional who has the highest likelihood of being a good guide to the problem. And there's no guarantee. There is no profession where you are guaranteed to get good, competent help. But there are professions where the odds are better. Now we get into reviewing professions, which is a very thorny territory. I've gotten into a lot of hot water over the years and generated a lot of hate mail over the years by talking about this stuff. Even my offhand comments about massage therapy that I've made in this podcast, that's the tip of that iceberg. I have a lot of opinions about the healthcare professions. How do consumers decide whether to go to the acupuncturist or the physical therapist or the physical medicine and rehabilitation doctor? In the case of the last one, PMR is the newest medical specialty, and nobody knows they exist, but they're awesome. They're like a super physical therapist, and all other things being equal, they are far better qualified, trained, and prepared to deal with difficult cases than any other single professional category. So if you were an injured athlete or a regular non-athlete type person with chronic body pain, your best odds are going to be with a PMR physician every time. But most people don't know that profession exists. So I try to tell them. And of course, to some extent, I try to warn people about the issues they might encounter in other professions, like, say, chiropractic, which is attached to all kinds of well-known controversies and not so well-known controversies. And my message to people is not all chiropractors suck, because they don't. Some chiropractors are fantastic. The message is, how are you going to tell the difference? How are you going to know? When you, as an average person, go into a chiropractor's office, how are you going to know whether you are dealing with one of the super quacks, and some of them certainly earn that title, or one of the awesome progressive ones? How are you going to tell? Without some education, you're not. Even with some education, you're not, in many cases. So I educate people about the controversies and make sure people are aware to some extent, but I've also had to draw a pretty strong line and not review professions too specifically. It gets people very, very upset. So I have to be very careful with that.
No one wants to hear that they made the wrong choice 10 years ago.
Yep. Yeah. And everybody's got their guy, right? Like everybody has a therapist they love. And maybe it's because they're fantastic at their job. And maybe it's just because they're really charismatic. Who knows? But that devotion is intense. But really where the trouble comes from is the members of those professions. Mm-hmm. If I get too specific and detailed reviewing, coming to conclusions about professions, it's like kicking a hornet's nest.
We see the chiropractor one quite a bit in our field, dealing with powerlifters, where they might be dealing with a little bit of minor back pain from a lift or something like that, and then they'll go see a chiropractor, and suddenly they're all out of alignment and they need to get adjusted 3 times a week for months on end, or else they just don't feel normal, or they don't feel like they're capable. That's something that we have to deal with quite a bit. Yeah.
You see a lot of lifters who believe that they need constant spinal adjustment.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is another great example of a nocebo. It's not that they're being hurt in the body by the nocebo, but they have a belief and a fragility and a vulnerability that leads them into a never-ending expenditure and a never-ending worry about the state of their spinal alignment.
Paul, let me ask you a related question. Let's pretend that an athlete fully believes that a treatment causes them relief. Whatever the treatment, and maybe let's say the research doesn't support that. Is it better as a coach, as an onlooker, as someone who cares about this person, to let them go on believing a false belief, or to correct that belief, even if you overcome the positive benefit from a placebo they might have been experiencing?
Yeah. That's so hard. It's one of the reasons I stopped being a clinician. It's one of the hardest things about actually working directly with people. As a publisher, I can do one-to-many debunking. I can publish debunking information that isn't a direct personal response to someone's statement, but information that anyone who's looking for it can find and read. And that is so much more comfortable for me. And I mean, I gave up on personal debunking and trying to find that delicate balance. But my rule, by the end of my time as a clinician, my rule was basically they have to ask. And I might flag the controversy. So I might do the Harriet Hall thing. I might say, do you know who disagrees with that and why? Mm-hmm. Without implying that I disagree or that I know why. But I would raise that, are you aware that some people have this other position? And then if they ask, if they have a track record of curiosity, if it feels basically socially wise, then I might get into the critical analysis with them. But mostly, it is so true that you cannot force a horse to drink after leading him to the water, that I think it's mostly just not worth it. You put forward your own recommendations, you answer questions. If directly asked, you will debunk. If someone says, is this bullshit? Then you can say, yes, this is why. But not before then, because it's just, people just can't do it. They can't quickly challenge a cherished belief. It's just too difficult.
So as let's say a wind down question here, this is something that I know Bryce was interested in going over, and it's a little bit specific, but it's very applicable to the athletes we work with. Let's talk a little bit about stretching. It's but Bryce, to quote Bryce here, I feel like stretching gets a bad reputation. Mm-hmm. So does it work, and what does it work for, if anything?
Mm-hmm. Oh, you're just going to ask me, aren't you?
Oh, outright. See, this is like, let me rephrase that. Is it bullshit?
Yeah. Nothing that feels good is bullshit. And it feels good. I mean, I stretch every single day just because it feels good. But I'm not sure what I'm doing beyond that.
You put a lot of emphasis on the word just there. Just because it feels good.
Yeah, because I can't justify any other motive. I can easily justify it based on the fact that it feels great, but I can't justify it any other way, and I have tried and I've tried. My inability is not due to a lack of trying. I've spent 20 years experimenting and researching and studying, and there are no popularly stated goals for stretching that stretching can actually achieve. This is an important point, so I'm going to repeat it in slightly different words. The reasons that people give for stretching are not what stretching is actually good for. So injury prevention, recovery is a big one. I see how well I can do this from memory. And treating pain, relieving pain. It is not good at these things. It might be good at something else. Stretching might have other benefits. And the The big one that's in the gray zone in the middle is flexibility. But flexibility, this is the tricky thing here. Stretching will increase flexibility. We know that. That works. The problem is, so what? What good is flexibility? Flexibility gets a lot more credit than it deserves. People believe it is inherently valuable to be more flexible, almost like it's a metaphor for life. You should be more flexible in your mind and in your body. This belief in the inherent goodness of flexibility is really powerful. But if you get specific about the details of performance in different kinds of sports, there are relatively few sports where flexibility is actually all that valuable. And we all know the obvious examples are things like gymnasts, martial arts, contortionists. Not like there's a lot of those, but plus they all have genetic diseases that make them more flexible. Which is it's actually a highly relevant point. And I just read this, fresh science news, a study of dancers. The sole purpose of the study was to identify anatomical abnormalities in dancers. And the conclusion, this is specifically what it said in the abstract, was dancers are freaks. It didn't say. That's my translation.
Yes, they are.
Dancers are freaks. They have so much wrong with them. It's crazy. I mean, we've all heard stories about elite athletes of different types who have various.
Sorry, I just can't get over that right now. I'm sorry.
Any dancers in the house? Any dancers?
Not
You're
here.
freaks. You're freaks. Like, have you heard, for instance, that many sprinters have unusually long calcaneae, long heel bones? You know that one? That's a thing.
For the
I believe it though.
Foot spring.
Yeah, it gives them better leverage on ankle dorsiflexion, makes them better sprinters. They are also freaks. They are genetically different on average. Elite sprinters are not built the same way as the rest of us. So with dancers, it's a really profound phenomenon. They are very different because they have very specialized needs, and so they tend to self-select. The only people who progress in the dancing world are the people who've got the anatomical oddities like hip dysplasia to be able to do things that other people simply can't do. So are they talented? Yes. Are they anatomically different? Yes, both. And that's also the case throughout the entire world of athletics. Now, to tie this back into stretching and simultaneously, check this out, simultaneously tying it into the world of chronic pain. Incredibly common out there in the world are this class of genetic diseases that disorders of the connective tissue. These are the hypermobility disorders, the most famous of which is Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. But there's a whole family of them, and they're non-rare. These are not rare things. These diseases, obviously, people with these diseases are more flexible. That's their signature feature. It's not their only feature, but it's the main one. They are more flexible naturally. So that's how we're going to tie back into the inherent goodness of flexibility. Can we say that flexibility is inherently good when we know for a fact that the majority of the people in our society who have it they have it because of a pathology? That's an interesting perspective on that. These diseases are also linked strongly to chronic pain. So basically everyone who has these diseases, which can be super subtle, you can easily go your entire life and never get the diagnosis, but you have chronic pain because of it. Mm-hmm. You are really flexible and in chronic pain. So how much stretching makes sense for that person? And what does it say about the value of flexibility? So a bunch of these people have self-selected for different sports and activities. You get, your contortionists, quite literally, probably all of them are pathological. They probably all have one of the hypermobility disorders. So the ultimate example of self-selection. But then there's, for every contortionist, or every person who could be a contortionist because of pathology. You have insane numbers of people out there who've got a little bit of it. There's a little bit of it going on. They're naturally more flexible and a little more prone to body pain. Should they be stretching? Do they know who they are? That's a real fly in the value of flexibility ointment. So you need to stretch if you need to be flexible, but hardly anyone actually needs to be more flexible. And 3/4 of the people who are flexible because of a disease. So that's a very different narrative about the value of stretching and flexibility than you normally hear.
No, that's a good answer, and I think a good takeaway from that is, you need to be appropriately flexible for the task you're trying to complete.
Correct.
And not anymore. It's, so if you're doing powerlifting, that's not very flexible unless you're trying to look like one of the mega arch bench press specialists, which I would bet that some of these guys have some of those pathologies that you're talking about. You look at some names that we look at in powerlifting, the Owen Hubbards, the Sean Noriegas, these guys that are able to have such a short distance between their upper back and their pelvis when they're bench pressing. There's probably something related to one or more of those pathologies that you're talking about there.
Yep, definitely possible. Yeah.
Very interesting consideration. Of course, if you talk to them about it, they would probably say, no, I worked on this and I built this flexibility. And so, there's no real way to know.
Could be all of the above.
Yeah.
Well, I think Eddie, the guy from Sweden, is actually a gymnast as well, isn't he? Eddie Berglund.
Mm.
Yeah, and it runs in his family too. I think his dad was as well.
Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. Well, I think this is a good place for us to wrap it up, unless you guys had any other questions.
No, that's wonderful.
All right.
Awesome, Paul. It has been a pleasure.
The rest is on the website.
Yeah. Check out the website, www.painscience.com, spelled exactly how it should be, and all kinds of really interesting information. We have barely scratched the surface of what is a very, very broad and deep pool of information.
Thanks, guys.
Paul, I've recommended your articles to many, many athletes and was sad that some of them were behind a paywall, but also happy for you because I know you're making a living as far as that's concerned and want to make sure that people give back to you. So besides the content you have on your website, are there any other resources that people have access to, books or anything like that?
Meaning, do I want to recommend a book or another website?
Yeah, no, anything that you put out yourself.
Oh, anything that I do. Oh, plug my own stuff. It's all on painscience.com.
Okay.
I'd be delighted if anyone bought a book, but most of the content on my site is free. It's about 50% by wordage and 90% by number of pages. So there are hundreds of free articles, but a few of them are behind a paywall, and it's a great way to support what I'm doing if you want to buy a book that seems somewhat relevant to your issues.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. I think people have learned a lot, and certainly your website's a resource for decades to come.
Thanks, guys. I'd be happy to do it again sometime.
It was definitely very informative. And before we wrap up here, one last shout out to SBD USA. We love you guys. Thanks for supporting our show. And with that, I think we will come to a close.